Welcome to this month's Portals community call. Hope everyone's doing well. I'm Jason Gumpert from MS Dynamics World. I'm pleased to be able to host this event with Nicholas Hayduk, our resident Portals expert who runs these calls and has been doing so for quite a while now. As we get started, please do know we do welcome your questions. Look for the questions block in the webcast interface. If you're here live, we're also recording today's event. So without any further delay, Nick, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much. All right, got a good crowd today. Wondering if any of it might be related to the first news items that we have to talk about today, but we will jump into it. It's either people are interested in the latest news on portals or people want, we got some developer folks who want to learn about React. So, all right, let's dive into this. So, quick intro. My name is Nicholas Hayduk. I am the president and a software engineer with Engineered Code Consulting, Inc. Microsoft MVP with a focus on Power Apps portals. Having started my career with ADX Studio, the company that originally built the portals and was acquired by Microsoft in 2015. Would be more than happy if you were to connect with me or follow or any of those social media words with me on any of the platforms that you see listed there, LinkedIn, Twitter. I've got a blog, which hasn't been my priority lately. I've been focusing a lot on the YouTube, and as well as we got a link there to the Refresh the Cache podcast, which I co-host with Nick Dolman, of which there is a new episode out in the last, I think we recorded it a couple weeks ago, and so it's been out for a week or two now. So would be happy to connect with you on any of those platforms. As always, just want to thank Jason and the whole team at MS Dynamics World for helping us out with these calls. Jason does great work getting the word out on not only this call, but a whole bunch of other great community events, keeping the world up to date on what's going on in the kind of Power Platform space with Microsoft. So thanks to Jason and the team over there. The agenda, we're gonna, as always, we're gonna talk about some portals news. Today's kind of deep dive topic is using React with Power Apps portals. And we'll talk about the next portals community call, and we'll see if we have some time for Q&A. Hopefully we will, although I may open it up for Q&A after we talk about some of our news items. So let's get into it. All right, portals news. Okay, the elephant in the room is that Portals has been making front page news. I was surprised to even see this on CNN.com. It was on the main page there about this quote unquote data leak, 38 million records, so on and so forth. I think originally there was a publication in the to kind of describe the and if you want to know my personal opinion on quote breaches, I think it's a little bit out of proportion. It really is a situation where Microsoft, to be fair, Microsoft probably made it too easy to set up it in this way, but it certainly wasn't a bug or some sort of like something going wrong. It was like people did things in a certain way that they may not have realized what the implications were, even though they were specifically, within the documentation, it was highlighted pretty well about what the implications of certain settings were. Yeah, so essentially what was happening is on an entity list, there's an area about exposing the data from that entity list in an OData feed. So if you check the box that says expose this as an OData feed, that right away there's a URL that you can go to on the portal that you can see any of the records that would be displayed in that entity list. So every page of records that's in that entity list goes through that endpoint, an OData endpoint on the portal. And that was kind of the big concern, is that if people check that box, but that's kind of what the feature was for. So I think that kind of the bigger concern was just the fact that the enable entity permissions or enable table permissions was and never has been checked by default when you create entity lists or lists in the backend using the portal management module-driven app. That's the way it's always been. Microsoft kind of inherited that default behavior from ADX Studio when it acquired it. So to be clear, if you never checked any boxes, there was no real kind of potential for a data breach. What they are kind of calling the data breach is the fact that some people would check the I want to expose OData, but then not consider what the permissions were around that. So you could expose OData, the OData feed, and not have any permissions around it. So if you expose an OData feed of contacts, every single contact in your system was publicly accessible. So again, I'm kind of more on the side of like if you checked that box and you didn't know what it meant and you didn't check the permissions, shame on you. But Microsoft is reacting to this. They are. I've seen a couple things. So I think anyone who may have been in one of those situations has been notified. Another thing to kind of when you see these clickbait headlines about 38 million records, it's one thing to say that there were 38 million records that could have been exposed or technically were exposed, but you have to consider that most of those no one knew that they were there. So it's not like 38 million records were stolen. It's just there was the potential for that. And I think realistically, I'm not aware of any actual misuse of that data. I'm not saying there was or there wasn't. I'm not aware that any of the data was actually misused. But it's one of those where it's like, yeah, you maybe left the door unlocked, but if you didn't get broken into, is it really a breach? That's, I guess, not for me to say, but I certainly think that some of the headlines were looking to attract attention, probably a lot stronger than the actual underlying concern might be there. So, one of the fixes that, and I'm not exactly sure whether it's rolled out already or it is coming, but essentially that enable tables permission functionality is going to be removed. So it will not be possible to have an entity or a list that does not respect entity permissions, which is fine. I mean, we, as our best practice, we never really relied on checking that enable entity permissions. You can achieve the same thing by enabling entity permissions with the anonymous web role. And I mean, to be honest, we so rarely, if ever, use the OData feed feature. So not something that we were really, not really, the risk was low because we just don't use that feature. And so we pretty much always have entity permissions turned on for table or for the lists, and we don't use the OData feature. So it was kind of the perfect storm of you have to use that feature and not turn on entity permissions for this to be concerned. But it looks like Microsoft is essentially making it so that the enable entity permissions becomes irrelevant, and you must, essentially enforcing that that's on all the time. The other thing to note is that this was really, I think, only an issue if the entity permission, or if you were creating your lists within the portal management app. Microsoft had gone to a kind of default entity permissions on model within the studio and the other interface for creating these lists. So yeah, it was just a case of kind of the old legacy way of creating them, just had never been updated on that. So I see a question here. So how would one track down where there may have been misconfigured on an existing portal? So yeah, why don't I just kind of quickly show the easiest way to see if something like that's misconfigured. And the easiest way is just to do some advanced find, because it's really quite simple. That's one of the nice things about the lists being just data on the portal or data in Dataverse. So I'm just going to bring up one of my portals here. So if I were just to look at my entity lists, or depending on which version of the solutions, it might just say list there, but lists, entity lists, same thing. So the key here is you've got this enable entity permissions. If that is yes, then you weren't really subject to what the concern was. You've also got this OData enabled, no. So you'll see that I don't have OData enabled for anything. So I would not be kind of subject to this, what they call this data breach, because the OData feed just wasn't enabled. So if you wanted to be kind of doubly sure, what I'm recommending people do is you just do a quick advanced find. Now this might take a second to load up there, but you just do an advanced find saying, do I have any entity lists or any lists where OData is yes and enable entity permissions is no? If you run that query and you get no results, that means there were no page. And again, it's not that, like, you may have some of those where it's perfectly acceptable. So just because you do have some entity lists where the permissions were not enforced and there's no data feed, maybe that's exactly what people wanted. There's lots of reasons why you could want to do that on purpose. So that's why it's less of a like, hey, this is something broken, versus people didn't realize what they were doing despite the kind of the warnings in the documentation. It may come as a surprise to some people, but not everyone reads all the documentation. So, guilty as charged on that one myself as well. But if this advanced find interface ever loads, I can show you how to do kind of a quick advanced find, simply looking for lists or entity lists where the enable table permissions or enable entity permissions is set to no, and the OData feed, what do they call that column? OData enabled is set to yes, and that's really all it is. Run that query. If you get no results, you're fine. If you get results in there, then you just have to analyze whether those were done on purpose, and go from there. This is taking a second to load. If anyone ever is curious as to why advanced find takes a while to load, the first time it's because it has to go up and spin up a whole bunch of infrastructure in the back end to bring the old kind of classic version of Dynamics up, because advanced find still uses kind of the old pre-unified interface. And so those resources aren't on all the time. So if you're the first one in a while to need access to that old interface, basically you got to spin up those servers, kind of turn them on. So that's why that advanced find takes a while. So yeah, so we got entity lists. I'm just going to go into the details. I'm going to clear this. And so if I say OData enabled equals yes, and enable entity permissions, or again, could be entity or table permissions, depending on the version of your solutions, that equals no. Run that query. I get no results, but if you get those results in your instance, there. Yeah, and I got to see a point here from Nikita about those other filter icons, which are way better, but I'm a dinosaur. I'm stuck in the old age. But yes, you can definitely go in here. The only thing about this is that it's filtering on this, so you get this advanced filters. But yeah, Nikita, you're right. I'm just old and keep forgetting about those. So, are there any other questions on this topic? I know I got many emails from clients or partners that we work with saying, oh my God, did you hear about this? Are we did any of our data get lost? It's like, no, like we wouldn't put you in that situation, because I mean, it's something that most of us who kind of do a lot of portals work, like we know what that combination would do. And the other thing I would look out for is just, when we do our security audits, because we often get asked to look at an implementation of a portal kind of after it's been done and look for any kind of gaps that there might exist in the security model. That was one of them. Anytime you have an entity list with it where entity permissions is not turned on, that's something that you kind of have to say, okay, was that done on purpose? Like, why is that? And the other one would just be any entity permissions or table permissions where the scope is global, because often global entity permissions will get created during development as people are trying to play with the data model, trying to get the permissions all sorted out, and then they'll kind of get left out, or they get forgotten about, and all of a sudden you launch and you realize, hey, we've got global entity permissions that give people access to records they shouldn't. So a couple of things to watch out for just to make sure your portal is nice and tightly secured. All right, so I'm moving on here to the next topic, which this was technically something that came out right before the last call that we had back in July, but I hadn't really had a chance to go through all that, and so I'm taking an opportunity now, and that is the 2021 Release Wave 2 plan. So these are the items that Microsoft has stated that they intend on releasing during the 2021 release wave, which is essentially October through March. So October through March, this contains a list of the things that they're intending on releasing. So it used to be called the October release wave, but that kind of gave people the impression that everything would be released in October, and that's not how this works. They will be released throughout the 6-month period. So essentially we have the release wave 1, which is kind of April to September, release wave 2, October through March. So this is what Microsoft has said to expect for Power Apps portals related functionality over the upcoming months. So the first one that I kind of find interesting was the relevant search in portals. So this is kind of exposing and replacing the existing site search, which is okay, it's fine. It's I get questions all the time about, how can we improve this? What can we do to make this better? And it's really there's not much configuration that you can do with the search out of the box. So starting to enable working with the relevant search that exists in a kind of in Dataverse in the backend in the model-driven apps and in Dynamics, taking some of that functionality and putting it on the portal. I don't know if we know a bunch of details about exactly what this is going to be, but just seeing that the search is going to get essentially an overhaul using some of the more recent technology that's built into the platform, that's great news. The other thing I just wanted to point out is the last podcast that Nick Dolman and I did was kind of going deeper into this. This was the topic of the last one. So if you want a little more of a conversation, if you're interested in these release wave plans, you can check out the podcast that was released a couple weeks ago as we dived a little bit deeper into these topics. The next one here is the Web API. So first of all, Web API is generally available already. So what they are doing is they're adding a few more features. So one of those would be the ability to read. Now, with the kind of the preview and what was generally available, the Web API was only for create, update, and delete operations, and they are adding read to it, which is fantastic. It seems like to some people, like, well, you could read with Liquid, and that was kind of the reason that it wasn't there to begin with. That's why it wasn't priority number one, because there was other ways to read data from Dataverse, but it just makes it so much nicer to just have a consistent, here I can go to the endpoint. It's essentially a full REST CRUD API that we can use. So it's really nice to be able to read data as well, so you're not having to resort to kind of a different technique and you got kind of stuff in different places. So read with the Web API, as well as the ability to invoke custom actions in the Web API. So that allows you to create those custom actions in Dataverse. There's lots of things you can do with those actions by building out, with the kind of the citizen developer type interface for building out business processes, and then you can invoke that from the Web API. So I know we've traditionally back in the day when we were using ADX Studio and we could, write our custom C# code, a common technique we used was to, put as much of the business logic as we could into the custom actions, and they were available from workflows, and it was quite a nice architecture. And we had to kind of get away from that a little bit with the Power Apps portals, because we just simply didn't have a way to invoke those unless it was through the run workflow capability. So this gives us a lot more opportunities to leverage custom actions, which I think are a really cool tool. Next item here, PCF. So as part of release wave 2 2021, we have general availability. So right now they're still in preview. So what's coming up is that they will be generally available, which means they are essentially kind of approved for production use. So if you call up Microsoft and have some issues with it, you're going to be in a position where it's supported versus anything in preview. They've kind of got that fallback. So generally available, that's great. Field components. So this is what the preview was. So the ability to look at a basic form or an advanced form and look at one of the fields and replace the out of the box control. So if you can think of like a text field or a field that held a numeric value, the kind of the prototypical example is turn that into a slider. So you can replace a single field on a form, and that's what the original preview for PCF on portals was. So that's obviously included, but what they're also adding is the ability to just add PCF components via a liquid tag. So it doesn't necessarily have to be bound to a form. You can just simply, wherever you want, if you have a PCF control, drop it on your portal, wherever you can drop in liquid, which is almost anywhere. So it's really cool, and I'll be talking about how that kind of perhaps impacts the discussion that we're going to have today about React, because it could replace some of what we're doing right now with React. Doesn't necessarily replace the need for React, but it could mean a different deployment method than what we're currently doing for our React projects. And then finally, Web API support. So This is the fact that within a PCF control, you can essentially define that, hey, I have a dependency on the web API, and it will essentially give you a reference to the web API. Currently, in the preview, that was not supported. So if you want to use web API, you kind of had to hard code it and talk to the portal's web API specifically. Whereas this, if I understand the discussion that I saw, is that this will allow you to retrieve a reference to the web API in the same way that you retrieve it for any other types of PCF control. So you get that reference passed in as part of the context, and you can use it that way, which makes the PCF control more, more versatile in that you can use the same PCF control in a model-driven app or Canvas app or a portal, whereas before, if you wrote one and you used the web API, it was very much portal specific. So it just makes those PCF controls a little bit more, or quite a bit more versatile. All right. If you have any questions about any of that news, please do feel free to drop that in the chat. But I will keep going and get to our topic, which today is using React with Power Apps portals. I'm going to take just one quick, put myself on mute for a second for a quick water break, and I will be right back. All right. So using React with Power Apps portals, that is today's topic. So I'm expecting that most people who are interested in the topic probably know what React is. But if you don't, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So it is not like a complete library for doing anything and absolutely, everything and anything in JavaScript. Now, that being said, there are modules that you can add into it that you can pretty much do anything with it. But React itself is primarily meant for building user interfaces. So for example, making AJAX calls or JavaScript calls to these services, React actually doesn't do any of that for you, but there are libraries that people have added to React to help you with that. But React specifically is about building user interfaces using JavaScript. Now, it is open source. It's developed by Facebook and the community, so it's open source, but Facebook was kind of the driving. It was originally released by some Facebook developers, and Facebook is the kind of the driving force behind it. Along with the community. So what it does is it kind of simplifies the rendering and interacting with data. So it allows you kind of build forms and kind of data bind stuff to it, handling events. It's just, it's comparable to other frameworks, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But like, the main, competitors, if we want to use that word, would be like something like Angular or Vue.js. Those are the kind of the different similar type frameworks that they have out there. So really what it does is, there's a lot of JavaScript kind of that's written underneath the hood that simplifies doing, a lot of things like declarative event binding, things like that. So the other thing that we really like about it is the fact that it's kind of a component-based architecture. So you can build these components and they're very kind of reusable. You can reuse them throughout your app. So that's another thing that we really like about React. So why do we personally, like at Engineer Code, why do we like to use React? It does seem to be Microsoft's preferred framework. Like I don't know if whether they've officially said it but it just seems like, for example, with PCF controls, they'll often be using React in their control samples. Like if you write a PCF control, you don't have to use React, but a lot of the samples will do that. Another thing would be the Fluent UI. So if you're familiar with what used to be called the Office Fabric UI or Office Fabric UI Fabric or whatever it was called, but essentially the UI framework that is used to build Dynamics and Office 365 and I think SharePoint, like all these different apps, Microsoft's kind of consolidated and trying to use the same underlying visual presentation so they don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Microsoft publishes that so that you can then use that so that your add-in, so for example, if you are writing a PCF control that you want to drop into a model-driven app, if you use the Fluent UI web controls, you can make an app that really feels like it's part of the app as opposed to trying to worry as much about kind of styling it yourself. So those Fluent UI web controls have a React library that they provide. So they give you a lot of controls that you can use out of the box using the React framework. So there's an active community behind it. There's lots of plugins and modules that you can add to it. On NPM, there's a bunch of packages that you can add. The other thing is that it works well with TypeScript. I'm a lover of TypeScript. And so when we're writing our React apps, we are writing stuff typically in TypeScript to build them. So for all these reasons, I would say primarily just because in the Microsoft Power Platform ecosystem, it seems like React is kind of the most common platform. So it just kind of gives everyone a common language to be talking. So that's kind of why we've chosen to use React. We have historically used other ones. Before we got into React, we did a lot of Vue.js. We've even done a little bit of Angular when we're talking about like mobile apps because of the like Ionic framework, and there's some stuff with that. But we kind of historically did start off as doing more kind of Vue.js stuff, but have kind of transitioned to working primarily with React. So where do we use these React apps or components? So there's really kind of two main purposes. And now one way that we do not use it, maybe I'll start off with what we don't do it. We don't use React to replace the entire page of a portal. So it's not like you build your React app and that becomes the portal. Because if you're doing that, then you're essentially rebuilding the entire interface, and that's not something that we've really done. But what we have done is kind of two main things. So one would be to build a single page application, but that's put between the header and footer of the portal. So you got your header, you got your footer, between that there's a page, and on that page is where we'll place a React app, and the React app will become responsible for that entire page and the contents of that entire page. So we've done that. That's a pretty common thing where it's like we got to build a really sophisticated UI that we can't achieve with, say, lists and forms. So we build a React app to do that. Another thing that we've used quite a bit is adding small widgets of functionality certain places and kind of embedding those into our web pages in certain spots. So we'll build a web template and we'll just have like, hey, we'll put a little widget there, a little app there, and do it that way. So you can have multiple React apps on a single page, but that's kind of the two areas we are typically doing, using the React app to be the entire page between the header and footer, or just inserting small little bits of functionality into web templates. So we're still kind of leveraging Liquid and other techniques, but we just drop in little React apps where the user interface is a little bit more sophisticated, and React just lets us do that a lot more efficiently than it would be as if we had to write everything from scratch. So how do we do this? So this is maybe the most interesting part, if there were to be an interesting part. So what we do, and I find that in this space, one of the things I find most challenging is the fact that there's literally like a million different ways of doing this, different ways of packing things up, different, you can use JavaScript, you can use TypeScript, you can use, like, there's so many different combinations of ways to do it. So I'll just describe what we've done, and it's maybe not even the best way. It's just the way that you get introduced to these things by different people, and it's the way that they've done it. So it's more of a case of this is kind of where we've gotten to over the last few years. Using this as our primary kind of technique for doing this type of development, and it seems to work. But would also be interested to hear if anyone else is doing this kind of work, and what they've got working for them. So we use Webpack. So Webpack is a tool within, like, kind of works in the whole NPM space, where we take our React apps, we build them, and that produces a JavaScript file that, and it also, with our NPM, and when we do our builds, it takes all of our TypeScript, compiles it down into JavaScript, and produces a single file that contains all of our contains all of our apps. Now, what we can do is one of the kind of key considerations is when you have these multiple apps in React, you can either choose to bundle them all into a single file, or you can kind of split them up, and so maybe each app has its own file, or maybe you can bundle 3 or 4 apps in one and then another one. And so we generally kind of look at it as we'll bundle all the apps together into a single file that exists on the same page, so that we only have to kind of refer to one JavaScript file that is that bundled app. But So yeah, we basically, and then what you can choose to do is you can, because React itself is a library that you need to include essentially the source code for React. What we've done up to this point has been to include React as part of that file. But what we're currently working on is maybe splitting out that React, the React components to either serve that file separately from the portal, or maybe more ideally is to use an existing CDN to serve those React files as well, so that we don't necessarily have to bundle, and we could potentially take advantage of that user's browser already maybe having cached that React file. So, but that's what we kind of use Webpack to produce. We take our React app, build it all up, give us a JavaScript file, and then what we do is we take that JavaScript file and we add it as a web file to our portal. So just know that if you're adding JavaScript files to your portal, those JavaScript files go on as notes into Dataverse, and we always kind of just temporarily change the file extension limitation. So by default, .js files can't be uploaded as notes into Dataverse. What we do is we just change that setting momentarily, upload our file, and then put that restriction back in place, because it is nice to have the real extension on those files. So that's what we typically do. So we remove that restriction, we add it as a web file, and then what we do is then we include a reference to that JavaScript file and the required markup. Typically, the way it works is that you have a particular div on your page that has either a specific ID, or has a specific class that it's looking for, and it takes that div and puts all of its stuff in there. Let's see. So I'll just kind of show you what that kind of looks like in what we have as kind of a starter React template that we use. It includes kind of a hello world example. So I'm just going to kind of go through what our standard kind of starter template looks like. So what we have here is, so within our source directory, we've got our app. So in this case, we actually have 3 apps. So we have a date time picker example, we've got a hello world, and we got a multi-app example. So this thing contains 3 apps. Now these apps also use these components. So you can see we got the sample input, sample output component. If I look at my hello world app, it will be using sample input, sample output, and content snippets. So some of these different components we're able to kind of reuse across our different apps. So if I look at this date picker example, this is an implementation of a Bootstrap date picker into React. And then we have this multi-app example, which what this one does, the main difference between this one is that it's looking for a particular class with app-root. If we look at this hello world, it's looking for an element with an ID of root, which there should only ever be one element on the page with a specific ID, whereas this one is an example of where you could have this same, in this case, it's looking for app-root. So you could have divs all over the place that have that class, and all of those will get replaced with this app. So in some cases, you want your app to be once on a page, in some cases, it could be multiple. So I'm not going to get too much into like how does React actually work. That's a whole, 12 years of learning. There's whole courses dedicated to doing that. So I just kind of want to show a little bit more on how do we actually, how do we get from this? So assuming we got our React app built, here's our TSX file. So we got our TypeScript. We're using JSX in here. I then take this. I then run a build of this, and what it does is it produces this dist directory. So within my Webpack, I configure which entries create which things. So again, we could combine some of these apps into a single file, but what I'm doing is I'm producing 3 different JavaScript files. So I would see JavaScript files within the hello world, multi-app example, and the date time picker. So in the distribution directory, now that my Webpack has compiled successfully, I would get these JavaScript files. So the key is taking these JavaScript files and uploading those into the portal. So this is the index.min. This is the JavaScript file that contains really everything that you would need in order to build or kind of take your React app and put it on the portal. So the key is taking this JavaScript file and get it onto the portal. to do that, again, what we do is the very first time is we just we take this JavaScript and we upload it as a web file to our portal, using whether it's a model-driven app, using Portal Studio, using the front side editor. Any of those techniques will work fine for getting your portal or getting your web file. Then I'm just going to show you what the actual page looks like. So I created a page on my portal called React. I'll explain what this is in just a second. But really all I do then is I know that my particular, if I look at my Hello World app, don't want to do that. Put that back in there. Nope. These docking windows can be a little confusing sometimes. Put that back in there. No. All right. There we go. All right, so we can see here that we have a div with an ID of root. If I go back to this, we'll look at my hello world, which you can see is looking for this get element by ID root, and it's going to replace this with this particular markup. So I'm just going to go to my thing here, and I should be able to go to this. If I refresh the page here, what I should see is, so this is my React app. So the React app has this welcome to the portal React app project. This is a sample app that can be applied to a portal. All of that is coming from here. So we got this. We'll talk about the content snippet here in a second. And we got the sample input, sample output. Those are the different components. And what it does is as I type into here, it actually reverses it down here. So if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, we get 4, 3, 2, 1. So this whole area here, if I look at the actual source for this page, actually, if I view, close this, if I actually just view source, all we have is this. It was just a div ID of root, but then the React app essentially uses that as container and inserts all of the rest of the stuff in there for us in that React app. So let's kind of, and so what happens is as we're building out the React app, as we're making changes, we just use the XRM toolbox, the portal code editor. Load my items here. So what I can do is I can just go into the web files, and I've got my index.min.js, which was that thing. If I ever need to update it, I can just kind of essentially copy and paste the file into there. And you can certainly get fancy with Azure DevOps pipelines, which will take your React apps, build them, update the files. You can kind of do that. That's more kind of relatively standard React building stuff, not necessarily portal specific. Then you take that and then you upload the data in Dataverse to make those changes. So let me just flip back here to the presentation. Over here. So the next thing I want to talk about was developing or debugging. So it would be a bit of a pain if every time you want to test some changes from your portal or from your React app on your portal that you had to do a build, copy and paste, upload the thing, probably clear the cache, all that sort of stuff. So that's not how we actually operate. The other reason that would be bad is if you have 3 different developers working on unrelated tasks, but they're working on kind of the same, perhaps the same app, but different parts of that app. You get in a state where each one of those needs to update the web file while they're working on it, but you can't have all 3 kind of writing each over all the time. So what we do is instead we use Fiddler. So Fiddler, the classic one, and we use autoresponder rules. So within Fiddler, you can configure autoresponder rules, which essentially hijack the requests that your browser would make to the server traditionally, and you can replace that with files from your local machine. So as an example, what we do is, if I go to, there we go. Yeah. So in this particular example, we know that it's this index.min.js. So rather than kind of serving this from the portal itself, we write autoresponder rules in Fiddler that say, hey, if you get a request for this index.min.js, which if I go back to here and I go view source, is this one right here. So this would be at slash, the portal /react /index.min.js. You can say, Fiddler, if you receive a request for that URL, rather than going to the server, you can actually serve it off of your local machine. So we would point that at the file that exists here in this distribution build directory. So we'd point it at this. So then all we have to do is update our code, run a build on our local machine, refresh the page. The browser doesn't realize that Fiddler is essentially intercepting that request, serving back a file that's actually existing on my machine and not on the portal itself. So you can kind of trick your browser into thinking it's going to that remote resource, but in fact it's pulling the file from your machine. So it's a relatively common technique that people are using for things like web resources, PCF controls for debugging them. So we leverage that same technique to build our React web apps. It just makes the development way more self-contained and a lot faster. So that's what we're doing with our Fiddler autoresponder rules to do kind of the local development and debugging. Okay, back to the presentation here. Yeah, the other great thing about that is that when you do make some of those changes, then you don't have to worry about clearing the cache either. Because your browser, the Fiddler will pull up that request or that local file every time. So you may have to worry about browser cache, but that's an easier problem to get around. Now, in terms of actually interacting with Dataverse, there's nothing in that React app that's specific to a Power Apps portal. So you can access the web API in one of those React apps. You just have to treat it like any other web resource that you can access. We typically use Axios as the library in React to do the AJAX calls that make the calls to the web API. But essentially, you take whatever code you want and you call it in your preferably in your TypeScript, and makes your calls to the web API. So there's nothing kind of special about that, but you can certainly access the web API. One thing you cannot do, I shouldn't say cannot, because there is technically, if you included your JavaScript or your React app on the page using web templates, you could potentially start inserting some JavaScript or some Liquid in there. But in general, the way that we interact with using Liquid, there's a couple ways that we do it. So if there's some data, and again, we're kind of talking about trying to retrieve data from Dataverse, knowing that right now the web API doesn't support read operations, so your only opportunity to read data from Dataverse is through Liquid. There's a couple different techniques we use. So one of them is if it's just a simple data, if you just need, like, say, the ID of a record or something like that, we would pass those in as a parameter to our apps. So for example, if I open this up in my hello world, so what you can do is you can have, in addition to defining what the ID is that it's looking for, I'm sure if I have an example in any of these. Oh yeah, so this so this would come from the title and the content. So the multi-app example, title, content. Do we have? Yeah, so you can see in here, we've got data class app root, and we're doing title and content. So we're able to pass in parameters to our application or to our React app through these data parameters on the div that's using to define it. So there's no reason that if I go to my XRM toolbox and I open up my web page, I go to React. Let's just assume I had a parameter. So we got the div, and so say we said data dash, portal ID. You can go like that, and then you can do something. Then you can just put your Liquid in here. So then this becomes a parameter that gets passed to the React app. And so that's the pretty straightforward. So here you could even do, like, say you are on a page where the ID of a record is being passed in the query string. You could do request.params. So something like that. And then when that liquid is rendered, again, everything React is all client side. So React doesn't act on any of this until this liquid's been generated and sent back by the server. So you'll see on the source, you'll see data-portal ID, and it would have, say, the ID that's on the query string, and then your React app can pull that in. The other technique that we use, and this is what this block of code is just using the window object to pass in data into the React app, because the React app does have access. It's all that JavaScript is running in the same context. So for data that's a little bit more complicated or complex, we don't want to put in, these data parameters, because this is really more meant for kind of single, simple items, strings, little bits of text, that sort of thing. So if there's something more like a list or an array, or, in some cases we're passing back lists of cities or provinces or countries, that sort of thing, what we'll do is we will just write some, using a combination of Liquid and JavaScript, add data to the window object, which is then easily referenced in here. So if we look at, say, window.content_content snippets, what we can do is, if I look at, so this is defining, there's an object on the window called content_snippets, which is an object that has this one key in it. If I go back to my thing here and I go into content snippets, I had one of my components was content snippet. We'll see that here, where you got content snippets, what's getting passed into here is we got this get content snippets. These are getting passed in from the window object. So within our types, so these are coming in from these content snippets. Right there. So these content snippets are retrieved from the global window.content snippet. So it does mean you have to kind of make sure that the handshake is happening appropriately. You got to make sure that you're creating the right names of your objects that get passed to your React app. But we do find that that's a great way of passing in data that's a lot more complex, and we'll do that for large lists of things or more complex data. Okay. And then what we're often doing with this is also talking to a companion app. So in the same way that you can talk to the web API, the portal web API, which is no data service, you can talk to a companion app, and that's an app that you control and write yourself, and you can talk to it using AJAX calls, securing it in a way that's often the same as the web API. So that's primarily over the last couple of years, that's been a big technique that we've been using, is use React, use a companion app, and you can build out really quite fancy things on your portal. So that's a very common technique that we're using. Okay, so what about UI frameworks? So again, React is about building out UI, but it doesn't have anything to do with this stuff. Like, it doesn't come anything to do really with CSS. Like, out of the box, if you just install React, you get no, it's about building out the markup, but not about the CSS or anything like that. So we all know that Power Apps Portals uses Bootstrap version 3. We talked about Fluent UI, which is using Dynamics, Office 365, other services. So you may be wondering, hey, can I take like Fluent UI and use that on my portal? And the answer is yes, you can. There's nothing that's going to stop you. You are going to end up with like multiple different UI frameworks on your portal, and you have to figure out what do you have to do to make it so that it feels like they're all coming from the same place, so that they don't feel like you have this disjointed, okay, the header looks one way, but then the body of the app looks something different. So we have used the Fluent UI on some of our portals when the client already had invested in some of those things. We typically in our React apps are using more Bootstrap 3 things, so that whatever styling we've applied to the rest of the portal just gets automatically inherited by a React app. So we tend to lean towards using Bootstrap version 3 components in React, and using all the styling that's available to us through that, just for that consistency. But in theory, you can use Fluent UI components. You can include those components in your React app, and it will work. It's just a case of making sure that you style it so that the Bootstrap and the Fluent UI is consistent, or whatever other UI framework you want to use. And so what about other frameworks like Angular, which is used by Microsoft themselves in the Dynamics 365 Marketing Event Portal, or Vue.js? And so again, we have our reasons that I've explained earlier for using React. We've in the past used Vue, but really they all end up in a very similar fashion. So most of the techniques that I've talked about, in the end, you kind of get a JavaScript file and some HTML that you got to include somehow. So all of these techniques should be very applicable to other frameworks. So if you're at a place where you need to build some complex app, but you've got a bunch of people who all know Angular, you should be able to use a lot of these similar techniques and get it working on a portal. You can definitely get Angular working, you can definitely get Vue working. I've seen all of those used successfully as well. So most of what I'm talking about isn't React specific. It's more of a how do you integrate a UI framework into a portal. And then what about the PCF? We talked about how in the 2021 Wave 2 release plan that we have the ability to include PCF controls via Liquid and without being bound to a field on a form. So that's the key there, is that you don't always have an entity form that you want to put on a page and replace a specific field. So then the question could be, well, what I've just described with adding web files, could you just do as a PCF control? And the answer is, yeah, for sure. I think you could. Since it's not out yet, I don't know what the gotchas are with that. But I do think that it would be it would be very similar. You would, instead of uploading your web files to your web files to the portal, you'd just be building your PCF control, and you'd be using the pack PCF push to push your thing. So I think really what it'll come down to is personal preference at that point. There's certainly a different deployment method. When you talk about using PCF, then your PCF control becomes part of the solution. So your JavaScript file is no longer data like it would be with web files, but it would be part of the solution. So it moves across with solutions, which may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing, depending on your opinion. So the other thing is that PCF itself has its own kind of learning curve. So if you already know how to write a React app, and then you want to learn, and then you got to learn how to do PCF, well, what value are you getting out of just dropping a PCF in there? So I personally kind of think I'll probably lean towards not doing it as PCF control if there's no other use for them to be as PCF control. That being said, if there's any way that what we're writing would be useful in a model-driven app or anywhere else that you can use PCF, then I think it would make absolute sense to make it a PCF control. So to me, I think PCF control probably makes things a little bit more complicated, but that may be well worth it if you're going to be using that in other places. So if there's potential for reuse, then PCF would be a really great option and allow you to do all your work in a PCF and just drop it on the page using some Liquid. So, all right, that's pretty much what I want to cover today on the React side of things. Did want to say that the next call we have planned is September 23rd at 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 12 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and 7 p.m. UTC. As always, another shout out to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World. And I will open it up in case there's any other questions about any of the news we talked about, React, or any other portals related topic.
Thanks, Nick. Great job as usual. While we wait for questions to come in, I just want to note we'll be sending a link out to next month's. It's actually, I think it's up now, but we'll send a link to you all for how to register for that one as well.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions. So if people have questions in the meantime, you should know how to reach out to me on all those social channels. Also always looking for ideas for what topics you want to see in these calls. Always looking for ideas on, if there are any blog posts or videos that you want to see. I'm seeing one question here quickly. Which one is best, Angular or React in Portal? Again, I don't think that there's necessarily best. It comes down to a multitude of factors. I think if you didn't know either, Again, we lean towards React just because it does seem to be kind of popular in the Microsoft area, especially with the PCF controls and that sort of thing. So, but I think if you've got skills, say already in Angular, I don't know if I would be, forgetting about all those things just to be learning React. So I think you can make portals. I think you can make nice portals with either React or Angular. And yes, the recording will be available. I know Jason puts it out. I put it out as well. So just watch the. I think we typically send out a link via email as well. So.
All right. Well, I think with that, then we will get ready to wrap up here. Nick, thanks again.
Thank you, Jason.
And thanks to everyone in the audience. We will conclude there.